This is a video tutorial for Phil 123, Module 3 on the cosmological argument. For my money, the cosmological argument is one of the trickier, probably the trickiest of the proof arguments that we're going to talk about. So I want to spend some time talking about it today and also distinguishing between a couple different things that you might have seen, say, on the online resources and the readings that are potentially confusing. For the last video tutorial, I forgot to wear one of my bow ties. I have rectified that situation today. I hope you'll forgive me. One of the things that's important to remember about the proof arguments is that there's lots of different versions of one. There's no such thing as the teleological argument. There's a sort of type of argument that we might call the teleological argument, but it has several different versions. Similarly, there's several different versions of the ontological argument. So with the cosmological argument, there's not just one kind of argument that we would call the cosmological argument. There's several different types of arguments that have been given that name. They have certain kinds of things in common, but we should distinguish them, and that's part of what I want to do today. One thing that all cosmological arguments have in common, all of them are based on a posteriori reasoning. So with the teleological argument, but they're all based on a posteriori reasoning. We observe that one thing causes another. We observe that there are contingent beings, and so on and so forth. Now, one of the historically, the best proponent of the cosmological argument is the philosopher St. Thomas Aquinas. Okay? Aquinas is probably the greatest of the church fathers, recognized as an authority by the Catholic Church. He's a saint, obviously. And Aquinas is famous for, among other things, arguing that there are 5 ways, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ways to show that God exists. And what you get in the readings are those 5 ways. Now, some of those 5 ways are more or less interesting for our purposes. The 4th way, nobody really talks about. The 5th way to prove that God exists, that we get from Aquinas, should seem familiar. That is an example of a teleological argument, and it's not what we want to talk about today. The argument that's most interesting for us the arguments that are most interesting for us are the first 3 ways that Aquinas offers to prove that God exists. These are all versions of the cosmological argument. Okay? Now, there's differences between them, and I want to focus on one of them in particular. But again, the first 3 of Aquinas' 5 ways to prove that God exists, the first 3 ways are examples of cosmological arguments. Now, we see the cosmological argument throughout Western philosophy, throughout other areas of philosophy as well, quite frankly. We see versions of the cosmological argument show up in both Plato and the Greek philosopher Aristotle. We also see versions of the cosmological argument show up in some of the Muslim and Arab thinkers in the medieval period. But its most famous version comes from St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, the kind of argument that Aquinas is offering is different from what we might call the Kalam argument. The Kalam argument became especially popular among the medieval Muslim thinkers, and it's been reinvigorated and revised and life brought to it again in the contemporary world with the philosopher William Lane Craig. But Aquinas isn't clearly running that argument. The Kalam argument depends upon the assumption that a certain kind of infinite regress, an infinite temporal regress, is impossible. That's what that argument turns on. It turns on the assumption that everything that begins to exist must have a cause of its existence. Okay, that's the basic idea. Everything that begins to exist must have a cause. And since the universe began to exist, even cosmologists who talk about the Big Bang would agree with that. There was a time that the universe didn't exist. Actually, that's misleading. The universe didn't always exist. It came to exist. So the universe must have a cause of its existence, according to the Kalam argument. Now again, what the people who are fans of the Kalam argument suggest is that a certain kind of infinite regress is impossible. Anything that exists in time must have a cause. In the same way that you exist in time, you must have a cause, namely your parents, and your parents exist in time, they must have a cause, namely your grandparents, and so on down the line. According to the Kalam argument, it can't be that there's an infinite regress going back forever, where everybody's existence is explained by their parents. Okay, that leaves something unexplained. It would leave something unexplained. We'll talk about Aquinas' version of the argument where that really gets nailed down. But again, the crucial thought is that there can't be an infinite regress of that type. That's what motivates the Kalam argument. Now, Aquinas' most interesting argument is different from that particular argument, okay? And what we begin to see, not just with Aquinas, but also with some of the 18th century philosophers like Samuel Clarke, who I've asked you guys to read for this particular module as well, is that they gave up that assumption, okay? They came to allow that there could be that kind of an infinite regress. Everybody's existence is explained by their parents, and their existence is explained by their parents, and so on back down the line. But there would still be something left unexplained. Okay? The most interesting of Aquinas' arguments is actually his third way. And here he talks not about a first cause or a prime mover unmoved, but what he calls dependent beings, or well, I guess I'm calling them independent beings. A dependent being is something that exists for something else, for its existence, either for bringing it into existence or for its continued existence. An independent being, by contrast, does not depend on anyone else for its existence. An independent being does not have parents. An independent being does not need something else to preserve its existence. An independent being is, if you will, explained by itself. At the very least, it doesn't depend on any other being for its existence. Okay, so that distinction between dependent and independent beings is crucial for Aquinas' argument. To also understand what's going on here, and here the William Rowe article on the cosmological argument is again really, really helpful. What was at stake for Aquinas and the 18th century philosophers who were impressed with the cosmological argument is what we might call the principle of sufficient reason. Now, exactly what the principle of sufficient reason is supposed to express is a little bit controversial, but Rowe has a very helpful discussion on page 50. According to the principle of sufficient reason, there must be an explanation of the existence of any being, but really there must be an explanation for the existence of any fact whatsoever. For any fact, any positive fact about what there is, about who exists, about different kinds of relations, any fact must admit of an explanation. There must be some adequate explanation of why that fact obtains. There must be something that explains why the cat is on the mat rather than on the couch. Actually, I have no cats around me today, so there's nothing to explain. There must be something that explains why it would rain today rather than not. If there's something left unexplained, that would violate the principle of sufficient reason. There would be something in the universe that doesn't get explained, and that was unacceptable for the 18th century guys, but also for Aquinas as well. So you see why this is relevant when we're talking about people's appearance and explaining their existence. Even if for every particular person you can explain why they exist by pointing to their parents, there's still a question to be answered. The question is not why does this guy exist, but the question is why are there people rather than no one at all? Why does the universe exist rather than nothing? That positive fact needs to be explained as well. And we can't explain it simply by pointing to the fact that people have parents, because we have to explain not just the existence of individual beings, we have to explain the existence of the whole universe. That brings us into Aquinas' third way, okay? And this is the one that uses the distinction between independent beings and dependent beings. Okay? What Aquinas thinks in a complicated passage in that third way is that we can't have simply a collection of dependent beings running around. Okay? We can't simply explain the existence of every dependent being by pointing to some other dependent being. There would be something missing. There would be something missing. Okay? Aquinas' third way runs something like this. Every being that exists or ever did exist is either dependent or it's self-existing, an independent being. But not every being can be a dependent being. Therefore, there's got to exist a self-existing being. And that particular being, that being is supposed to be identified with God.